Hi, everybody. My name is Edison. Thanks for joining us. I'm an advisory board member at Agents in Advertising and head of brand marketing at FinTag, a fintech startup. I'm honored to be moderating this discussion on effective employee resource group, aka ERGs. Having worked both on brand side at a Fortune 100 company and agencies such as Ogilvy, I've seen ERGs be performative, and on the opposite end, a safe space that can have real business impact. And we obviously want more of the latter. So speaking for the panelists, we want each of you to take something actionable from this conversation. We have agency here, so let's use it. As such, we'll hit the following topics: understand why ERGs exist and why they're important to our community, understand the fundamentals of what an effective ERG needs to be, and understand how you can improve ERGs at your organization. On that note, I'm excited to introduce our panel. I'll start with Van, if you quickly introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Van Tran. I am a first-generation Vietnamese American. I've spent, oh gosh, I hate to say this, but the last 20 years navigating marketing and technology, and I'm currently a principal at Credera management consulting firm within the Omnicom umbrella. On top of that, I am also co-chair of Omnicom Asian Leader Circle, a global cross-agency ERG, also founded OPMG API Collective, an ERG that's a network within the network, as well as leading some of the DEI efforts within Credera.
Great. And Sean, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Yeah, Choi here, Korean American, based out here on the East Coast, New York City, Brooklyn. I'm currently at Martin Agency, based out of Richmond, Virginia, but really happy to be here, really stoked to be chatting with y'all. I come from a strategy background and also head up the OPI ERG at Martin, so we'll be able to speak to that.
Great. And last but not least, Jerry.
Better? Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Jerry Wan. I too am a Korean American man. Apologies to Edison for way too many fun food photos on my Instagram while I am visiting New York City.
So jealous.
He might kick me off this panel any minute now. I am not in the advertising business officially, but I have been in marketing roles throughout my career. I do speaking in addition to running our Dear Americans podcast. I do work with a lot of ERGs from the other side of being brought in as a guest speaker and a workshop facilitator. So happy to share my thoughts on sort of how I think we can make everybody get more involved and have more advocacy and have more voice. But I do want to give a big shout out to Senna, who is on the call, who has been instrumental in making this event so smooth and just have the trains run on time. And so while we have an audience, I do want to shout her out and congratulate her on a successful event. Happy to be here.
Yeah, here. Thank you. And I forgot to mention that I too am a Korean American. We've got a big Korean representation.
One of us has got to go.
Exactly, right. So thank you, Van, Sean, and Jerry for those introductions. So why don't we just jump in? Van, what are ERGs and what has been your best experience and your biggest challenge with them?
Sure. Well, ERGs, employee resource groups, are usually volunteer-led, I hate to say groups or organizations within a company. And usually they're created in order to support and create community around a particular common theme. It might be ethnicity, it might be LGBTQ, but they're really made to kind of support each other within a particular framework. And in terms of what has been kind of highlight and challenges, in my experience with ERGs, it's so multi-level. When I think about things that are absolutely rewarding from a professional standpoint, this ERG that I've been part of has really opened my eyes to the realization that I needed this community. It wasn't something that I sought out when I was kind of younger and earlier in my career. I don't even know they existed, to be honest. but I didn't know I needed this, and this was huge. And through the experience of the rich experience of being part of this community, it made me want to deepen my relationships with my own family. It had me seeking out more information, their experiences, and understand a little bit more deeply, as opposed to just saying, oh, these are my parents. So that has been priceless, to be honest. And then from a challenge perspective, a lot of these things are passion projects. Like, you feel very strongly about something and you throw all of your energy into it. And sometimes there's a bit of balance that needs to be created, especially when you're operating in a kind of billability utilization model that a lot of agencies have. It's something to be mindful of. Not that I've had any of those challenges at Credera, but it is something that you're always thinking of like, okay, how much time do I put into this? And I will tell you, I put a lot of time into it, and that can be a challenge.
Thanks, Van. Jerry or Sean, do you guys want to chime in on that in terms of best experiences or biggest challenges you've seen from your vantage points?
Yeah, I do work from the outside now, but when I was at Accenture, most recently, a large consulting firm, and partially at WeWork, I always try to find a way to at least get to know people and then try to build community with fellow community members, whether it is formally or informally. I think, I'll speak to it more from an external perspective, but even internally, just a lack of support and resources is probably the most frustrating thing. It's an invisible burden that so many of us are expected to do, actually, compared to, and I'll just use, white people as sort of a placeholder, right? Like, we are expected to advocate for our own people by putting in more hours, after hours, on top of our daily stuff. And even though you're not penalized for not participating, some people wonder, well, why aren't you doing this for your people, right? And so there are a handful of companies, I understand it now, are paying for ERG leadership, LinkedIn being one of them. But even then, like, only the top person gets paid. The people who actually are working to put on events don't get paid. Highly under-resourced, expected to work magic and wonders. I've been asked by an ERG leader of a $100 million startup to get the friend discount for any of my services because don't you want to help your people? And so, I think the frustrations are there. I think both from a attention and energy perspective to do more. And this is not just for us, right? Women, Black folks, LGBTQ folks are all under the same umbrella of being expected to advocate without actual tangible support. I often joke that companies spend more money advertising what their ERGs do than actually on the ERGs themselves. Probably a poignant comment for those of us in the advertising industry. And I think it's sad. How do we change it? I don't know, but I hope we can fix this problem in the next 52 minutes.
Yeah, no problem. Well, Sean, actually, going to the next question. I know you're leading the effort to rethink ERGs at the Martin Agency. So maybe you can solve it in the next 52 minutes. But what are the critical components, in your point of view, to building an effective and sustainable ERG strategy?
It's a great question. A lot of pressure with the 51 minutes that we have now. But ERGs have been around for a lot longer than people probably assume. I think they date back to the 60s, but I think with the recent rise of DE&I, there's definitely been kind of emergence on the focus of them. But in my eyes, the problem is that their function is still overall murky and muddy, because just having an ERG today, at least from my perspective, this is more like a company satisfying a simple checkbox item on a list of DE&I initiatives, instead of a space that sees real investment and innovation and nourishment. And the way that we're starting to reshape ERGs here at Martin is by really understanding the various areas of value that ERGs can actually offer. So there's this really helpful resource out there that we've modeled our agency ERG strategy after. And that's a 4Cs framework by Robert Rodriguez. And the 4Cs being one, career, and that's the hiring, development, the promotion of ERG members. The second being community, the safe space really dedicated and designated for the group, and retention of talent. Thirdly would be culture, shaping the very agency ethos and the environment, and increasing everyone's cultural literacy as a whole. And then lastly, for commerce, that is just the overall contributions of ERG members that have a direct impact on the business. That could be anything from audience proficiency or internal consults or garnering more relevant insights and creative overall. So in my eyes, once we as OPI understand what these offerings are, it becomes that much easier to sell it into the execs, because those are the people that are really going to help move the dial. Our ERG strategy at Martin, it's still a work in progress by all means, but we're planning on sharing all of these learnings through resource for the entire industry, and all that in hopes to create some real change for all of us, and we can be more stoked about it.
Great. I love that. The 4 C's in particular. I know someone just chimed in with the 4 C's in the chat: career, community, culture, commerce. And we can certainly dive a bit deeper into each of those. But Jerry, Sean kind of laid the foundation, the strategy. What about from your perspective, since you have a unique perspective, as you mentioned, working with ERGs on an external point of view across many different industries? So what characteristics have you seen are consistent with great ERG leaders? And also, what are the characteristics that are inherent in organizations that have invested and have identified and put real resources behind making sure that the platform is set for great ERG leaders?
I think there's a number of different things. One, it actually comes from, sponsorship, mentorship, or, some sort of support from the executive level, right? And not just like, oh, I'll be your sponsor and sign a piece of paper, showing up to things, advocating and, tackling and blocking when necessary. And just, it doesn't matter if they're a member of our community or not. Perhaps it's more powerful when it's not, but just getting people to understand. And I think the overall theme is, does your organization see ERG as a cost center or as an investment in your people that can pay dividends forever and ever? Unfortunately, I think many companies still in the former camp of seeing ERGs as a necessary part of their DEI initiatives, which then becomes a cost center and almost something that you have to do now because it's the right thing to do. The best experiences are obviously when they invest properly into the events. Whenever so May is obviously a busy month for many of us, particularly those of us who work with the ERGs from the outside. And I often ask, what do you guys do outside of May? I mean, it's cool that we're doing this, having a conversation or a panel or whatever, but like what is happening year round? Can we do events, workshops year round? Do you do mentorship programs, or is this, how much of your annual budget do you spend in May? And then that's 2 parts, right? So you can tweak the number on the numerator and the denominator. My big, rallying cries is we want to increase the denominator so that your percentage of spend in May looks smaller. So, intangible, what that looks like is people with larger titles getting involved in the planning process, giving younger people the opportunities to shine, doing things that are more than performative. And so, I've been to one too many, I'm sure many of us have, of somewhat offensive ERG events where they're like, hey, it's May, so we're going to eat dumplings and, call it a day. And it's like, well, we didn't learn anything and we didn't really talk about what the problems are. And so, that's what bad looks like. But what good looks like is when you host whether it's an APAM event or otherwise, and the CEO shows up, obviously in more cases than not, it's a white guy. And so if they show up and actually is leading and modeling through example that this conversation matters to more people than just the agents at your company, that's important. But I don't want to sound like a one beat drum, but actual investment dollars, right? Like per event and also across the board. And there's no magic number that works, right? Like, and what we want to be careful of here is playing the scarcity game and being like, well, what does a black ERG do? And if there's more of us than them, shouldn't we make more? Like that's a lose-lose game, right? Like, what is a number that is sufficient to have actual real programming so that people don't burn out, that people are rewarded? I don't know the truth is, I just something I thought about, like how much of an ERG budget is spent internally so that they get rest and they get celebrated, right? Like, or is all ERG budget going to external people like me to say that we want to maximize it, and then you're relying on all sorts of emotional labor internally? And then thinking about how actual organizations at the top operate, right? Like, you don't think your CEOs and the C-suite goes to some fancy ass resort up in the mountains somewhere to strategic plan for the next 5 years? Why don't ERGs do that, right? Like,
Right.
we're burning out literally trying to do other things for other people because we're so giving. And we feel guilty about even going out to dinner with the executive team of the ERG because that's money that could have been spent otherwise. And so, sorry, I get fired up about this stuff. So I can go on, but I'm going to pause there for now.
I think the C's of Sean's 4 C's career in particular, and to add on to Jerry's point, the time investment, money is one thing, and I think we should talk more about that, but how it's incorporated into your yearly review, right? Is it incorporated into your salary too? Van, what are your thoughts on that in terms of how you can position it and help you advance your career and help it build those relationships too that you may not have access to in your regular day-to-day job, but through this ERG, through exposure to senior leaders, you can build those relationships that are critical to career growth?
Making DEI as part of the measurement in terms of impact, I think is going to be a big deal.
Mhm.
This isn't speaking from an ERG perspective, but Credera actually does that. It's part of my goals. It's part of the things that inform my merit increases, etc. Like, am I making a consistent impact? And I get the choice to determine how I want to make an impact, and I'm spending it doing this work from an ERG perspective. With Asian Leader Circle and OAC, it's been interesting as we think about impact right now because it's cross agency. So our ability to really create change or enforce things at an agency level is a bit different, right? So like, you can't force an agency to set up the same goals that Credera does. You can only create an example of that and show what the results are from a satisfaction standpoint. The one great thing that is very helpful, at least at the holding company level, having an ERG that's cross agency, is that we actually have the benefit of numbers. So statistically, we can go and get a lot of information across all of these agencies when we're doing a survey. And we say, hey, by the way, our API community is extremely scared to go out into the subway in New York. You may want to think about that when you're thinking about your come back to work plans and communications as you move forward. So we do have that ability to have that discussion because we've done the polls, we've asked the questions. Additionally, by honestly creating the programming that we have and really thinking about the mission that we have put in place, which is somewhat similar to what Sean is talking about. For us, it's like unite or community connect, as well as like elevate and create support in terms of career. So very similar in terms of framework, but we're thinking about our mission there and looking to see what are the KPIs to move the needle, and we share that back. So we're in the middle of compiling all of that information from a KPI perspective. What is the programming that we put in place that actually aligns to those goals? Like, are we helping people build the skills that they need to build? If we're trying to, our objective, smash that bamboo ceiling, then what are we doing to arm our community with programming that will help them do that? So that kind of information, when we share that back, that's going to be very impactful in terms of what we're doing. And, it's hard to really measure retention in terms of things like that. That's been a discussion that we've been actively having of like, how do you actually measure the impact of retention and satisfaction of staying within a particular agency? Because there's so many different factors involved. So we continue to kind of refine those KPIs, but the effort is that we continue to do it, right?
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And to add to what Van just said, a lot of this is also contingent on leaders being invested, right? And leaders staying engaged. So Sean, from your perspective, how can we make sure that this isn't just a hot thing that's been all the executives across all the agencies have been talking about for the last year plus, and it's something that's truly sustainable and that they continue to show up not only in May, not only over the past year, but in the next 3 years?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, I think it's about compromise personally, and that's where I'm never going to expect a white exec to know about our culture, to take the initiative. And I also feel that us as API folks, we know the most about our culture and our needs. And I think it is just an open channel of communication. So that's why I always hit on really helping build the value that ERGs can bring in all the members, because once that's established, as long as you bring a plan and something that you want to execute in a quarter or in a year, I think it's just that much easier for the sell-in. And what I found is extremely crucial is to get sell-in on all levels of leadership. You're going to get a C-suite person. If they have the sign off, then we know that higher up there is that support. However, you think about it, middle management, they're the people that are going to help create the space for all of your ERG members to attend to things, to participate, to engage. And so for me, I feel that it's truly selling in and communicating and aligning with leadership on all levels to make sure that this is something that's top of mind all year round. And it then allows you to get to a level of specificity and even intersectionality later on once that's established. But it does take some time. It does take some advocacy, but I definitely think it's attainable. I think the biggest problem that a lot of people have is that they don't either have the foresight or the time to have the foresight to come forward with a really solid and thought through plan. And thus it's usually something that's kind of scrappy, half executed, and eventually people don't see the value of it. And so I think taking the time to build that relationship, to build that support from all levels of leadership is something that can really help some driving change.
Yeah, no, it's I also think it's a growth opportunity or leadership opportunity for people who want to step up, right? And again, get exposure to these senior leaders, but also learn the critical relationship building and communication skills that all of our jobs require, no matter what discipline we're in. But Sean, you mentioned one thing, and I'll open this up to the group, and certainly everyone in the chat, feel free to drop questions as we're talking. But how do we make sure that these ERGs are inclusive, right? That we balance the need to make sure that it's a safe space for members while also being inclusive and welcoming to allies?
That's another great question. Just ERGs, since their very existence, they were designed for those with similar lived experiences and passions. Just to Van's point in the first comment about what are ERGs. But most often, like, these are marginalized communities. And thus, I think no matter what, hands down, ERGs, they should always be protected and prioritized for those that are in those marginalized groups or those that identify. I think true progress, however, will take place when we can work with our allies. However, first and foremost, I think it does come to the folks that are within the actual ERG. But in my mind, a higher level way to approach this is really considering the different audiences whenever there's any ERG programming and planning taking place, because everyone can feel more visible and included if you really diversify who you're catering the programming to. There's obviously the ERG itself, but then there's the wider company. And then lastly, the industry. And so for us at Martin, because our last API event was solely for our group, this Heritage Month was all about the external. So for example, For the agency, we sent an all agency email just to really bring the visibility and education around the cultural moment. We also spoke with our friends at Agents in Advertising to come guest speak. We're coordinating, spotlighting the creatives that identify on the agency social channels. And that's just for the agency, but then we had separate things for the industry. We're publishing a resource with Ad Week. We're having our members speak at panels such as this and other kinds of events. So all in all, planning for the varying audiences and doing so with intention and clearly communicating the why up front, I think you can better mitigate those potential feelings of exclusions that allies can sometimes experience, and that sensitivity that some members can have around creating moments just for the actual ERG itself.
I'll go ahead and chime in on this one. One of the things that Omnicom or ALC and OAC has done is created safe spaces. So definitely thinking about when there are sensitive discussions, particularly last year when we had the Atlanta spa shootings, creating an untown hall that was specifically for API to talk about their fears, to talk about their anger, their frustration, and things like that. And it was absolutely a safe space. But following that, in kind of to complement some of that, providing a little bit of insight that includes a session that may have allies in there, and that level of vulnerability and sharing is really important. And I think, in order to create change, you have to create connection. And there is that kind of layer of humanity that ideally everybody can relate to and think about, because everybody at some point has been discriminated against. So thinking through how do you create opportunities where you're connecting on that point and being able to serve up the nuances and specificity that's associated with at least our API community. And the same really goes for kind of cultural things. I mean, there's things in which people have all sorts of assumptions for the Asian or API American culture, and it's very unique. I mean, you grow up listening to the same music, you're in the same cities. So kind of dispelling that perpetual foreigner opportunity is really just sharing our lives and who we are and being very visible about that. So, that's an opportunity for us to kind of highlight ourselves, but also break some of those myths.
On the topic of inclusivity, I think it's a really good one, and I want to answer it from like a more broad perspective, right? And so we call this APAM or whatever alphabet letters your company wants to call it. But is it really fair for us to have conversations that encompass 4 billion people? That's not possible, particularly from the differences between the Asian American experience and the PI part, or now, we're starting to include the NH or the Native Hawaiian part. I don't want to speak for others who are in the audience, but like, there's like 3 Korean dudes and a Vietnamese woman here, right? Like, we don't understand that. I think companies, especially PR folks, start adding letters to make it all inclusive. My personal point of view is that we get rid of the letters that we have no intention of honoring. And so I'm very specific whenever I do my work to say, like, this is coming from a broad Asian American and more specifically my Korean American experience. You should actually invest the resources to bring in professionals who can speak to the PI part if you want to have the audacity to speak to that PI part, right? And so how many of all the APM events that we go to collectively honor that part? Very, very few, right? And none of them do it well. And so but that's not a ERG specific thing, right? I think in the ERG context, it's like, okay, it's not a matter of like how many people can we fit into the limited ERGs that we have so everybody feels included. It's how many ERGs, do we need to create so that everybody feels included? And so the intersectionality there too, right? So mixed race folks, adoptees, people with disability, LGBTQ, they live at the intersection of Asian and something else. And so being mindful of being intentional about who you want to include in these conversations and then mindfully including them, I think is, to be frank, an impossible challenge. And I think it's okay to admit, to say like, hey, we cannot be everything for everybody, but we're really going to be good at this little piece here. And setting your own boundaries so that you don't get called out for performative actions. And then I do want to address one thing. Ben asked the question in the comment, like, how do you get the silent API coworkers to engage? Maybe they don't, right? And that's fair, right? And I think those of us, look, it's Friday at 5:30 in the East Coast. There's 137 of us here. Like, we care about this stuff. But then we can't assume that just because they look like us, again, like dispelling the model minority myth or the monolith myth, we can't assume that everybody wants to do Asian stuff. And we have to allow for that part too, that everybody's on a different journey. Maybe they've been harmed by somebody. And so, it is also being mindful that you can't just like assume like, hey, there's another Asian kid, bring him into our circle. But it's, I think, one-on-one, hand-to-hand combat, like figuring out how that person wants to work, how that person doesn't want to work. I think we've all been in situations, whether in school or at work, where there's definitely people who don't want to engage. I'll share a quick story. I'm on the road with somebody we work with, Patrick, who is a Korean adoptee, and he grew up in rural Indiana. And it wasn't until 2 years ago that he really started to adopt for himself, no pun intended, but really accept his own Asian Korean American identity and began on this journey of finding out who he was. If you met him prior to that moment 2 years ago, he would not want to do anything with Asian American stuff, period, because it was a topic that he did not want to address, admit, or engage in. And so, I think we also have to be careful for all of us to our own community, because there's a level of comfort to not judge a book by its cover and to allow for people to want nothing to do with us. That's okay. That's hurtful to us because we are doing this work to advance all of us. But part of it also means that, there are people who are not going to want to engage.
Yeah, I 100% echo that. I think at the end of the day, all this starts with empathy, right? Is understanding that everyone has their own journey, everyone has their own acceptance of who they are and how they want to define themselves. And it's being able to respect that and understand that, and have empathy for what they're going through or what they may have gone through in the past. I do have a question though for, again, the panel about intersectionality. So we've talked about, there are so many of these groups, and as Jerry mentioned, we can break them apart into micro groups, micro communities, but at a macro level, how can we work with our Black brothers and sisters, our Latino brothers and sisters, to make sure that all of the ERGs are being represented and the voices are heard, while also maintaining our voice and our strength and our community? How do we balance that?
I think you look at it from a point of inclusivity, right? If you're approaching everything with curiosity and inclusivity, that is definitely a macro way of approaching that, of like, is my communication inclusive? Am I making assumptions here? And you see a lot of programming that comes out from HR and organizations that's kind of larger DEI and not necessarily within an ERG. And you can connect multiple ERGs upon a specific subject, right? We've had, at least for us at Omnicom, have had a few cross or intersectionality discussions where we talk about what it's like being a Black Asian person. We're about to talk about API joy in the context of pride. So, some of those things where you're really exploring what those experiences are. And to be frank, there's so much intersectionality that's happening right now. We have to address it. And it's just like, we can talk about those, I guess, pain points or points where you feel marginalized, and that is a macro experience, right? So I think that's the opportunity, is really thinking about what is the shared experience, how do we approach that from an inclusivity standpoint?
Thank you. I love that. I do have a question from the chat here. How did you get into your leadership role within D&I and take care of yourselves at the same time? I ask because I feel like I still have so much to learn within my own culture and community, and I'm afraid to make mistakes with sensitive topics and conversation. Feels like a huge responsibility emotionally too. it's a lot of pressure.
I have so many thoughts on that one, but I feel like I'm like, don't want to take up all the airtime here.
Do it.
I don't know that, to be honest, like it is a journey. I think we're all trying to figure it out. There was like another session where somebody said, as you get further and further in your career, you're going to find out everyone's trying to figure it out. And we're all trying to figure it out. Like I am constantly in a state of like, what is the balance for things? And why am I still working right now? I don't understand. And, I can't say no one's forcing me to do this. Nobody's got my feet to the fire. I just have this need to solve it. But then, I'll take a break. I mean, this week, to be completely honest, I'm with API month. I'm exhausted. I'm really, really tired. And I took a nap. I'm hoping people aren't like listening too much, but I was like, I'm putting this down. I'm going to go lie down right now because I'm exhausted. But you give yourself that grace because we're all trying to figure it out. And you're all trying to really manage not time, but energy. Like, how much energy do you have and how do you actually manage and measure that energy? I don't know if I answered that question, but I can tell you that's my experience.
I think understanding and just admitting that none of us are going to solve systemic racism in the country or in your company. We'd like to, but we can't, right? And so doing what you can, knowing that your work, equally admitting that your work is impactful, yet you can't do it all, I think is important. And I think maybe it's not the best time ever, but the best time yet to talk about mental health and how we take care of ourselves. And May is, after all, Mental Health Awareness Month as well. And so like, how do we live at the intersection of taking care of ourselves and whatnot? To the topic of intersectionality earlier before, I think it's and there was a question that I responded to in the comments. It often could feel like it's a competition between different identities, and that is a very scarcity mindset, fighting for slices of a small pie mindset. And I think our organizations and institutions make us feel that way. The goal is to grow the whole damn pie, and then we can all win and we can share more. For the nerds and the audience, pi r squared works in a miraculous way, right? But I also think, advocating for each other, right? So this always happens, right? When we talk about intersectionality, and I've done it too, it's like, hey, let's go get that one, Black Asian person to like head the panel, right? And it's like, well, why should they be held with all this burden of like playing for both sides? Like, what if we showed up together, right? And so, what's been really powerful for me in certain spaces is I'll purposely schedule an event with a Black female friend of mine. And when we show up in a space together, one, it confuses the hell out of the people. And then it doesn't make sense because that's not what the world has taught us to think. But then we start talking, we realize how much similarities we have, right? And I think that's how you build alliance, and that's how you build empathy. There's that question too of like fighting for airspace. Do you know how scary it would be? It's scary, good scary, if all the ERG heads together went into the CEO's office and said, you give it to us all, or none of us do this work, right? Like here we are advocating for our own Asian ERGs, but that's not the actual solution, right? The whole solution is like, hey, company CEO, if you really care about DEI, like it says on our website, we all need resources, and none of us are going to move the needle. So I think thinking about the work in terms of bringing allyship, building alliances, co-hosting events, not in our Heritage Month for no reason at all, I think is all important stuff.
Yeah, just plus one to all of that. I'd say the only difference is that my reference of nerdiness is probably a little different than yours, Jerry. I was going to go with an Avengers kind of reference where you're uniting everyone. You're all going towards the same path, or Model UN, whatever kind of nerd you are out there. But for us, we've actually formed a little, we just call it like the ERG collective. So we actually coordinate with all the other ERG leads. And I mean, there's the intersectionality of being biracial, triracial, but there's also the intersectionality of like learning through that intersectionality. For us, Lunar New Year this year, it fell right during Black History Month, and it competed, if you think about it that way. However, we had the foresight, we had the discussions, and we learned so much about each other's cultures. We respected each other's space. We collaborated on an event, but we also had our separate things as well. And so that's where I think we're going to get so much more done as a society if we do combine with other people that not necessarily have gone through the same experience as us, but the same difficulties and the types of emotions that they're facing. And that's where I really think alliance or allies isn't just a certain marginalized community and white folks. It can be intersectional in the sense of other races, other identities, other groups. And so, yeah, for me, in our eyes, it's a combined effort versus separate silos and people churning and doing the same work and overlapping and just churning.
Yeah, I will always remember, Jerry, growing the advocacy pie. That's what we're going for, right? And our community, but also making sure that our voice is not drowned out, right? That we all have a equal say and equal opportunity to be on that platform to speak our mind. There is a question in the chat a few times, actually, in different forms about what about starting an ERG after being told there's not enough resources? So we've talked about companies that have already put this forward. What about the companies that are like, nope, not here. We don't have the resources. We don't have the time. We don't want to single groups out, whatever it is. How do we push against that?
The smart ass answer in me is, are you at the right place then? But the more practical answer after that is, what do you care about in a company? Is it purpose? Is it salary? Right. If it is mission, then aligning. Obviously, if maybe they just don't see the value of it yet, or the reason behind it, and maybe that's where a few efforts and attempts could be helpful. Who knows? They might open up to it, see the value of it. However, if not, and you've given it a decent go, and there has been past or efforts, that's where I'd question. I mean, we're getting to a space in our lives, especially with the pandemic, in which we're questioning like, what are our priorities? Mental health. I mean, our community deprioritizes it the most, and we have cultural differences that have led to that. However, right now, like, is it really the salary? Is it really the credits and like all the accolades, or is it your own wellness? Like, who are you besides your title at work? And so it's a good reflective moment is how I hope you take it.
I recently had someone ask me about how to start an ERG. One of the first questions that my co-chair and I had, my co-chair Kim, who's on here, hi Kim, asked was like, how many API employees do you have? Like, what is the audience? And we started thinking through like what actually makes sense from a effort and impact standpoint. And so some of those questions kind of come up as you think about kind of decisioning. The other bit is we've got Asians in advertising right here. I mean, if there's not any resources, I agree with you, Sean, like, are you in the right place if this is important to you? B, if there's not enough resources, truly not enough resources there at your organization, can you seek out external resources? It doesn't always have to be in one place. And that's, as you think about satisfaction, joy, and fulfillment, they're not usually all in one place. You can seek out your tribe in a lot of different ways.
I got a lot of thoughts on this. So here we go. Number one, ERGs and understanding our cultural nuances and about us is never about the employee experience. Every company sells to us. We are the customer, right? And we can throw, we are the fastest growing immigrant community. We have the largest purchasing power. The numbers are there. And so it's about a lack of care, in my opinion, if they say they don't have the resources, because they do have the resources, right? Look at how much your CEOs get paid. Look how, where they stay when they travel, how much they spend on happy hours. The money is there, right? Because if they do give you the money isn't even big anyway to begin with. Where I would go is to leverage the studies that exist, leverage publicly available information to basically shame them into allowing you for it and having to admit that they don't care, even though when they know it's the right idea. And so somebody linked the status report that launch opened up yesterday. That's fantastic. There's so many studies out there now, right? And if you don't know, Google it or, reach out to friends because they exist, right? So paint this, tell the story using facts that are defensible to say, hey, a diverse workforce and somebody who cares or a company who cares actually, maybe not correlation versus causation, but they do better financially. So it's actually, worth it. Two, and if you are specifically having a problem, please let's spend some time to chat, because I would love to share with you who's doing what work across the industry and how much money they're spending. Whether it is through shame or whether it's through wanting to keep up with others or whether it is in this hyper-competitive environment that the advertising industry tends to be, understanding that other people are doing it might get them to do it too. And for me, the work is important enough that I take the stance of whatever it takes to get them to approve something is worth it. And I don't think a lot of Machiavellian approaches to a lot of different things in life, but it needs to get done, right? And there are people on this call that I'm working with on one-off events and also even more longer-term engagements. There are agencies that I've done so much work with and they feel comfortable. They just CC me in all their internal communications about any Asian ERG events. So other people are doing it. The lack of transparency hurts the people who need the help the most. And so, talk to me, talk to, Jesselyn, talk to Bernice, talk to anybody who has a larger insight, right? And I believe part of the reason why we're here, right? This organization, this event is to have this conversation, to empower you with the tools to go and fight for what's right. And Sean, you said, it was the smart ass comment. Absolutely not. If the place is racist, if the place doesn't give you a chance to thrive, leave, right? To stay is dishonoring yourself, right? And so it's hard. It is the toughest thing to fight for something you believe in and you keep getting told that it's not important. When they tell you that, they're telling you that you're not important. And so you actually have to make the decision, do you want to be in that toxic professional relationship? And sometimes you have to leave for them to actually understand that.
Yeah, I could not agree more. If it's not a priority, they can make it a priority. It's their choice that they're not making it a priority. So I would certainly encourage anyone to try, especially if you love the company and you really feel a sense of belonging there, try. But if you've hit a wall quite a few times and you've tried different leaders, then I think you know where the priorities are there. And there's a lack of priority on where there should be, especially over the past few years. If they're not paying attention now, I don't know when they'll ever pay attention. So one last question is kind of just last advice. Yeah, kind of open it up to the panel. What would you say to the ERG leaders up there, or the people who have thought about joining an ERG or who have been kind of participants but not leaders? What advice, one piece of advice would you give them to push this forward at their organization?
In terms of thinking about participation, I can definitely say ERGs always need participation. So showing up makes a big deal, because as we think about programming, we look at who actually shows up, who's interested in this information. If you want to take a greater, a deeper level of engagement with your ERG, there's plenty of kind of programming events for you to help out with. If you want to be taking a leadership role, those leadership roles can exist at a project level. I'm sure they exist from just an ongoing all year planning level. At least from my experience, there's always a need, because as Jerry mentioned, we're all resource strapped. So, kind of stepping up and just raising your hand and giving it a try makes a big difference. I mean, the worst that can happen is that you've decided like, I want to step back from this.
Sean or Jerry?
My thoughts would be just communicate more in a variety of ways. Ask for help when you need it. Internally, and I understand, having been inside large organizations, how scary that can be, and how threatening that can seem, because we all have social capital and political capital to lose inside large organizations. I would rely on organizations like Asians in Advertising and other groups that you belong to. Asians Leaders Alliance is another one that is a collection, or a consortium rather, of ERGs focused in our community. Publicly ask for help or publicly want to collaborate, right? Like many of you know, I live on LinkedIn, literally live on LinkedIn. And so every time I ask for help, the amount of responses that I get is mind blowing. And even though I've been blessed with a large platform now, I've been publishing on the platform consistently for 10 plus years. And that's how you build community. I have built friendships from asking for help publicly. I have gotten business from asking for help publicly. And finally, tell people thanks. I know one of the most exhausting things for ERG leaders is our insecurity that the work we are doing matters and that is impacting people. And so I'm sharing this on behalf of ERG leaders who are exhausted, burnt out, but keep going on. They need to hear from the people who participate in these events. Thank you, if nothing else. Send them a coffee, buy them lunch, do something, but a small gesture of gratitude, let them know that the work is actually meaningful and helpful, will go such a long way. Because like we said at the top, nobody's getting paid for this stuff. None of us are getting paid to be here now, but we care, right? And so, just meaningful, thoughtful thanks, and asking them how they need help or how they want to be supported is how we build a really strong and powerful network. Pam, yes, LinkedIn does, but it's only the top person. So it's, I just said earlier, Pam's got some fantastic resources too. So follow Pam online. agencydei.com is where you can find Pam. I'm actually a professional hype man.
You are. Boo-boo. The horns and everything.
Reggaeton horn on cue. Now stop.
Great answers. This one's got me thinking, but I'd say, simply put, explore your own identity. And if you feel like you have, go deeper. The reason I share that is, I think once we discover a sense of purpose, a deeper sense of purpose, I think it really builds up and creates a sense, like a level of passion that is the level that's going to drive real action. In my lived experience, at least, the silver lining of all the racism and the xenophobia during the pandemic is that it woke me the fuck up. I mean, I would not have connected with my identity to this degree otherwise. I wouldn't be as adamant about the advancement of our community if it weren't for that. I wouldn't be speaking to all of you here today if it weren't for it. So I'd say look inward, get familiar with yourself. And I think once you do, help someone else do the same thing. Whether it is a fellow API person or someone in leadership, help them see the vision. And I think really that's half the battle. And to tie it back to something we talked about earlier is just give yourself grace. I mean, these aren't easy things, not only from a physical standpoint of extra hours or an extra workload, but really the emotional damage that this can do, or the emotional exhaustion of everything that our community's been facing. It's rough. It's not easy. There's no beating around the bush for it. And so definitely give yourself grace, because it's, no matter what, it's going to kick your ass. It will undoubtedly burn you out if you don't. But the real lasting change, I think that's time and heart is what it requires. So besides that, hit us up too. We're always here to chat.
Yeah, that's a great way to end, Sean. Give yourself grace. And I did put everyone's LinkedIn into the chat. I think Bernice also linked to something as well. So we are all 100% open to connecting one-on-one and helping in any way possible. But I want to thank Unfortunately, this conversation needs to end. I know there's a lot more to cover here, but I want to thank all the panelists for their honest insights and advice. It's leaders like Van, Sean, and Jerry who are incredible stewards of our community that are the bedrock of agencies and advertising. So thank you for being here and for lending your voice. And thank you all for joining us for this important discussion. We hope we've equipped you with a few ideas that you can use and take to improve your ERGs at your organizations. Just two other things. If you haven't already, please take the AIA survey. That information is critical to helping us be a better organization for you. And please be sure to check out the next event, Creating Communities, to hear more about how to create impactful communities. Thank you so much, everybody.